So we're in the book of Jonah. We're going to be taking a look at Jonah chapter 2 this morning. Next week we're going to take a little bit of a break because it's VBS. We're going to actually go back to 1 John. I'm still going to encourage everybody to show up, even though you've heard it all before. It's a good thing just to constantly be reminded of God's love, to constantly be reminded of the fact that God loves us. He loves us despite ourselves, in spite of ourselves, and with the intention of, through His love and through us experiencing His love, that we would then share that love and communicate that love and live that love out for those around us in our community. That's really the big theme of VBS. We're going to have rocket ships and everything else up here, and maybe we might even go to the moon. I have no idea what's going on. But it's going to be fun. It's going to be lots of fun. It's going to be great. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. And then the week after that, we'll go back to Jonah. We'll wrap up the last 2 chapters for the book of Jonah before moving on to our next series, which is going to be based on the book of Titus, the New Testament. I knew that. I wasn't just stuttering. I knew that. Out of the New Testament. Titus is a great book in and of itself, too. Gospel for the good, the bad, and the ugly. Just more grace. Because in many ways, that's so much of what goes on in our life, and that's what characterizes our relationship with God is grace. Grace, grace, grace. The grace that we don't deserve. Grace that, even though we gave God every ounce of reason, like Jonah, to reject us, to despise us, to push us away, God's grace is still there and still comes after us. It's still offered and it's still available to us. And we continue that theme this morning with Jonah chapter 2. So Jonah is running away from God. This is where we left off last week. He's running away from God. He doesn't just despise what God is asking him to do. Jonah actually has a beef with God. He actually has issues with God himself. And so he's doing everything he can to get away from God. God came to him back at the beginning of chapter 1. He came to him commanding him to go to Nineveh. But rather than being obedient to what God was commanding him to do, and this was something that Jonah should have jumped at. He should have salivated over. He should have been excited and more than happy to go to Nineveh with this message that God was telling him to preach against it. Instead, he took off in the opposite direction of Nineveh. So God sends this huge storm. Jonah's on his boat. He's headed as far away from Nineveh as he can possibly get. And God sends this enormous storm, this huge storm, a storm that has never been seen before is the impression we get. A storm so big, so rough, so dangerous, so scary that everybody on board that boat is convinced that they're going to die in this storm. He sends this huge storm. And Jonah, eventually, he talks these sailors into throwing him overboard. He says, the storm is coming because of me. I'm the one who's responsible. Throw me overboard, and it's all going to calm down. You will be saved. And as a result, the Gentile sailors, they turned to God when they saw the storm calm down. They turned to God and they began offering sacrifices and making vows. They committed themselves to worshiping and serving the God of Israel. And that's where we left off last week at the very end of chapter 1. We're working our way through the story of Jonah, focusing specifically on that theme of grace according to God's sovereignty. And see, often when we talk about God's sovereignty, when we think about God's sovereignty, we think about it and we talk about it, as though, not really necessarily being something that's connected really to God's grace, at least not directly, not the way we tend to talk about it. For some of us, the idea of connecting God's grace and God's sovereignty and intertwining those two, and for some of us, that's a good thing. That's a point of comfort, something that we are comforted by and that we delight in, and we just kind of let out this sigh, just okay, everything's okay. God's in control. God's sovereign. For others of us, to think about God's sovereignty and how it plays into His grace and how it plays into salvation, it's more like, I don't really like that. What's the point of faith? What's the point of choice? What's the point of me putting out any effort for anything? Because it kind of sounds like that what you're saying is God has all this choice. God makes the final decision. So why do I even need to bother even believing? What's the point of that? Why should I even do it? God's going to choose anyway. The story of Jonah tends to look at sovereignty from a little bit of a different angle from where we tend to go with it. It says that because of our imperfection, God's sovereignty is at work when we realize that the grace we receive for salvation is exactly that. It's grace. It's a gift. We don't deserve it, and yet it's given to us. The sailors, while not deserving grace according to, it's kind of a strict reading of the law of Moses, they were spared and ultimately brought to recognition of the true God because of God's grace. Jonah makes a conscious effort to run away and reject God, and yet, while it looks like his life has come to an end and he's going to drown in the Mediterranean, we know he survives. Grace in unexpected places. After all, it was Jonah who blatantly disobeyed God, and the sailors at least had the sensibility to turn to God once he was revealed to them. In many ways, that's where the story should have ended. With Jonah overboard, flailing in the sea, and the sailors worshiping God, it should have ended there. But the Lord does as he pleases. Jonah 2 this morning, or actually I'm going to pick up with the final verse of chapter 1. I'm going to read all the way through the end of chapter 2. Jonah chapter 2 this morning. I'll read and then we'll pray. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to me. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord." And the Lord commanded the fish, and vomited Jonah onto dry land. There's another one of these. Let me pray a second, actually, before I get too far ahead of myself. Heavenly Father, Lord, I pray that you open our ears, open our hearts and minds, that we may hear your word, that we may be transformed by it, that we may be impacted by your grace, your unexpected grace in our own lives, Lord, and that we may praise you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Verse 17 again real quick, and we'll go on. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. This is another one of these power-packed verses in so many ways that we find so often in this book, where the author, he doesn't waste words, he doesn't add anything in that doesn't need to be there. He really condenses things. Everything, every little detail is important. And verse 17 is a giant within this entire book of Jonah. So first, the Lord provided. Jonah's overboard. And first, the Lord provided. He provided a huge fish. Again, the story of Jonah is all about God's sovereignty. So after Jonah is thrown into the sea, you'd think that'd be the end for him. But God has punished Jonah for his disobedience, for his arrogance, for his rebellion. He's punished him. But instead, the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. What kind of grace is that? Really, has anybody ever imagined, getting swallowed by a fish? Is that really grace? I don't know. It's all gooey and slimy and smells like seafood or something. I don't know. That doesn't exactly sound like a picture of grace to me. But God provided in the midst of Jonah's rebellion. He provided a fish to offer grace to Jonah. And so it begs the question, does the fish matter? Remember last week when I said that if you start kind of cherry picking pieces and parts and everything like that of the story, if you start kind of saying that, you know what, I'm going to take this, but I'm not going to take that. If you start doing that, what happens is you start popping holes in the message of Jonah, because every little detail is important. Every detail pushes us and re-emphasizes I'm missing the word here, but it pushes us to get the message, to get the point. You can't start cutting things out. He's been thrown overboard in the middle of the storm. We know he survives. He has to survive somehow. Why not ensure Jonah's survival by a fish? Why not? I don't know. That's the way God chose to do it. And that is the focus. That is the thing that Jonah, we assume Jonah wrote this story down. That is the thing that the book of Jonah, the story of Jonah, is pushing us to get to. What is God doing here? What is he doing? What is his action? What is he working out in the story of Jonah? And right off the bat, we see God provided. He provided. He provides. But this isn't just an ordinary provision. This isn't just kind of, God shows up at Thanksgiving dinner and provides the green bean casserole. It's not that sort of a provision. It's something more than that. It's something bigger, something deeper than just that. This is the Hebrew word manna. Manna. We tend to pronounce it as manna, like in the story of Exodus. It's the same word that's working at play. It's the same word that's being used there. And like many of the attributes and the characteristics that we've talked about, about God and, in the past year, this is one of those that God fiercely protects. He does not give this up. Only he can manna, and only he will allow himself to manna. Some have tried. Some have tried. In fact, there's one occurrence in the Old Testament, one occurrence in the Bible, where the word manna is used in reference to somebody other than God. First Chronicles 21 has a story about King David being enticed to manna, being enticed by Satan to manna. And God actually comes down pretty hard on him. It has to do with a battle that's about to take place, and God actually causes Israel to lose that battle, and they lose it pretty dramatically, because God says, no, you cannot manna. No human being can manna. Only I can manna. Only I can do this. Only I have the ability to do this. He fiercely protects his ability to manna, and he exercises that ability here in Jonah by ensuring that a huge fish was there in just the right place at just the right time to carry out his plan, to do his work, to save Jonah's life. Second half of verse 17 is where things start getting really good, in my opinion. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And keep your finger or your bulletin or put something there to mark your spot in Jonah, and flip with me over to Matthew chapter 12 a second. Matthew chapter 12. This is the only reference in the Bible to Jonah outside of the book of Jonah. And so you got to take this into account. You got to pay attention to this if you're trying to understand and work out the story of Jonah. In Matthew chapter 12, I'm going to start reading at verse 38. Then some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, this is referring to Jesus, said to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." And listen to Jesus' response. He answers, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jonah 2 is the background text for what Jesus says in Matthew 12. As Christians, if we want to understand Jonah 2, if we want to really grasp it and understand why is this in our Bible, what is the significance for us as Christians, if we want to really grasp it and fully appreciate at the same time what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 12, we have to look at both of these passages together. You cannot separate them. There's an area of theology it plays into this. An area of theology, it's not talked about very often. It's called typology. Typology. In typology, what typology is you're looking for a type. Type is a kind of a technical term here. A type of Christ figure that appears in the Old Testament as a foreshadowing of Jesus himself. We have to be careful in many ways with how we use this and how we go about doing this, because it's actually relatively easy to start reading things and look at things in the Old Testament and say, you know what, hey, that sounds and looks and seems to correlate pretty well with what we see happening in the New Testament. It's not really that simple. What a typology is and what we're talking about here is that real typology is an intentional act. It's something that was orchestrated and created and developed and put into play by God himself as an intentional foreshadowing of what would happen with Jesus. all of this has to point directly back to Jesus. And so what we see happening in Matthew is Jesus is going on record and he's saying Jonah was a type of me. If you ever wonder what the significance is of Jonah, it's not about Gentiles being saved. It's not about God just kind of saying, yeah, I know I made this covenant with Abraham, but I'm not going to pay attention to it. I'm going to save these Gentiles. It's not really about that. If you really want to grasp what Jonah is about and who Jonah was a type of me, specifically because of the 3 days and the 3 nights he spent in the fish correlates and lines up and is a sign of what is to come with me, of the 3 days, the 3 nights that I'm going to spend in the grave. What that means is that Jonah 2 represents a very real story of death and resurrection. As Christians, if we want to get Jonah 2 right, we have to read it in light of Jesus' own death and resurrection. I mentioned last week that there's a lot of kind of connections there between Jesus between Jesus and Jonah. This is one of those that I was going to pull out. So back to Jonah verse 1, chapter 2, verse 1. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, and yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. So Jonah, he's recognizing and he's admitting that he messed up. He says, you know what, I know God, I know I messed up, I get it, and now this is my experience. But in the midst of that, he's also, every now and then he kind of throws in this comment, he's realizing that he's also been the recipient of some pretty amazing grace in the midst of this. Yeah, might be in the belly of a slimy, stinky fish, but he's still the recipient of some pretty amazing grace. And he's realized that he still has a chance. Otherwise, he wouldn't be calling out to God to save him. Also notice, Jonah isn't offering up a wishful type prayer, just kind of in the hopes that, I hope this happens. I hope that everything turns out this way. See, there's a sense in these words that Jonah is praying here, there's a sense that he's got some pretty solid confidence that he will be delivered. Notice Jonah says, in my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me, and you listened to my cry. See, this is all past tense. It's as though his prayer has already been answered, the way that he's praying this. Jonah's prayer is technically classified as a Thanksgiving psalm. We've been doing a lot of Thanksgiving today. We've been doing a lot of praising today. We've been doing a lot of worshiping and a lot of just saying, God, thank you for this, thank you for that, thank you for your grace and the ways that you're working and you're playing out and you're getting yourself involved in our life. We've been doing a lot of that. And this prayer, when we look at Jonah 2, this prayer, in many ways, it kind of has these signs that it's been inserted into the story, sort of as an expression of what happened. It's almost like Jonah, he's recalling his experience. He's recalling what happened to me. It's not to say that he didn't actually pray. I bet you he did pray in the belly of that fish. I would have been. But it's not. But what we do have here is we have Jonah, in a sense, going back, reflecting back, and he's saying, this is what happened to me, and this is what I learned. This is the essence of my prayer, and this is what I learned through this experience. He's going back. He's processing what has happened to me. He's processing his experience. And that's why he's able to now look back as he writes down this prayer and he shares this prayer for us. He's going back, he's reflecting back, and he's saying, this is how it all turned out. What we see is a complete narrative, so to speak, from beginning to end of how God's grace worked for Jonah. And we're given a sense of how it can work for us. Jonah's prayer is poetic. Because it's poetic, we kind of have to look at the gist or go after the gist, the big idea of what he's trying to go after here. And the big idea that we have, the picture that we have in these 6 verses, or 5.5 verses, is a picture of utter destruction and devastation. In my distress, I called. Deep in the realm of the dead, I called. You hurled me into the depths, the very heart of the seas. The currents swirled about me. Your waves and breakers swept over me. I have been banished from your sight. Engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head, or in some translations, my throat. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. Jonah has lost all semblance of hope. He's devastated. He's come face to face with the reality that his depravity, his sinfulness, he realizes that in the place that he's in, that place, or that in that place of rejection by God, that there is no hope. He's dead. But it's not a quick death. It's not just kind of all of a sudden, we lose consciousness and we don't even know what's going on anymore. It's not a quick death. It's this slow, long, drawn out death, a death by torture and torment, a death that he is very much aware of and he's afraid. He doesn't necessarily want to be around God, but he knows that being separated from God is not a good option for him either. He knows that. You've been there, right? I mean, we've all kind of been in those situations before. We've all found ourselves, I think it's really only human to think we've all been in a situation in those places, those dark places where we question and we doubt and we're overcome with fear and grief and dread. We've been in those situations where we feel pretty helpless and pretty hopeless even. You remember sitting in a doctor's office, maybe for some of you, just by example, sitting in a doctor's office and you're receiving the news that you have cancer. I saw this when I was working as a hospital chaplain for a couple of months a while back. I saw this there, and I would be asked by the doctors to come into the room and sit in the room with them when they shared the news. And I saw it, and I remember seeing the pain, the shock, the fear come over people's faces. Because when you hear that word come out of the doctor or come across the doctor's lips, your first response, it's shock, it's anger, and it's an immediate fear of death. It might be an extreme. Some of us have experienced that, some of us haven't. But we've all felt hopeless at some point. And it's in those moments of desperation that we begin to struggle in many ways with God's sovereignty. Or maybe we don't doubt God's sovereignty per se, but we might start to doubt the place and the role of justice and fairness. And it's all initiated by these feelings of hopelessness. It's not a matter, in the story of Jonah, it's not a matter of God not being sovereign enough. It's not a matter of him not being strong enough or good enough or merciful or just enough. It's a matter of being in a moment when the brokenness of creation and us and you and me and the people around you, when it stares us straight in the eye and we realize just how desperate and dependent upon God we really are. What Jonah was experiencing in that fish was something that I pray no one sitting here ever experiences. Absolute hell. Absolute hell. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the current swirled around me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Thinking back to chapter 1 a second. It looks to us like it was the sailors who threw Jonah overboard. But Jonah says that it was God who did it when he says that I was banished from your sight. From Jonah's perspective, he was banished from God's presence by God. And one of the things that Jesus is quoted as saying when he was on the cross, hanging on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? See, if we're going to read Jonah 2 through the lens of Jesus' own death and resurrection, Jonah was literally cast out of God's presence. He literally experienced hell. And we cannot forget that Jesus' own experience was so that we ourselves would not go through what he went through. Then another statement of grace. Yet I will look again towards your holy temple. See, verse 2 details Jonah's repentance. Verses 3 through 4, they express Jonah's confidence that he will be restored, that he will be resurrected. After all, the Lord does as he pleases, right? Jonah's death was certain. He was not going to escape this. There was no hope. He had sinned against God by disobeying his commands, and God was killing him and casting him into hell for it. And frankly, according to the law, that's exactly what Jonah deserved. But then you have the second part of verse 6. But you, Lord my God, you brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. Confirmation of the restoration that verse 4 expected. Keep noticing, this is entirely God's doing. This is entirely God's work. See, Jonah doesn't take an ounce of credit for it. He doesn't say, I prayed enough, or I prayed good enough, or I did these things, or I had the right heart change. He says, no, God is doing these things. God is reaching down, he's grabbing me, and he's taking the action. Jonah takes responsibility for his initial actions, his initial rejection of God, but he gives full credit to God for his restoration. So initially, Jonah is in the depths of despair. His life is ebbing away, as he says. He is lamenting his situation. And in biblical lament, this is actually kind of a category. In biblical lament, there's always a but. A what? A but. Okay? There's always this moment, this point during a lament in which a person who is lamenting and who is grieving, who is feeling desperate and destroyed and just devastated, in which they turn away from that, and their lament now focuses on God's goodness and faithfulness and grace. And we see that happening with Jonah. Jonah's prayer is not a true biblical lament, though it's a thanksgiving psalm. I said that. See, the turn in a lament focuses on what we know to be true while we're still in the midst of our trials, while we're still in the midst of despair or lament. But Jonah, again, is reflecting back on what has happened. I know this can be a little confusing, a little difficult to kind of sort out, but what this looks like, maybe in more tangible terms, is that it's a bit like hearing somebody tell you a story of what happened to them and then simultaneously sharing what they learned through that experience. In many ways, that's a bit more encouraging for us as listeners. Because what we see is the bigger picture of God's sovereignty and grace rather than dwelling on the details. Jonah is doomed, absolutely. But then he says, but you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. See, Jonah is recognizing that his salvation, his life, is completely the result of God exercising his sovereignty and offering Jonah grace, even when Jonah doesn't deserve it. Verse 9 is really interesting. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will make good. Remember the sailor's response? The end of chapter 1. God calms the storm. The sailors, they immediately fall down and start worshiping God. They sacrifice and they make vows to God. And now here's Jonah promising to do the exact same thing. Jonah is finally getting the picture. He's finally figuring out what these Gentile sailors in chapter 1 already understood and figured out. And then again, a declaration that was 800 years before its time. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. I've preached Jonah before. This is not my first time going through this book. I've preached it before, and the last time I did, I entitled my sermon on chapter 2, I entitled it, Death and Resurrection in the Belly of a Fish. Because in many ways, it's exactly what happens in Jonah 2. See, according to Jesus, Jonah was intentionally set up and framed as a foreshadowing of Jesus' death and resurrection, which itself is a promise of our own death and resurrection. But really, God's hand is at work. See, just in that idea that what happens with Jonah in chapter 2, that was already put in the works in chapter 1, verse 1. everything that we look at, we tend to look at it as, this is all kind of happening by chance. God gives Jonah a command. Jonah decides, I'm just going to do things the way I want to do them. And then God responds. But no, what's going on here, because of this whole typology thing, because of the picture that we have of Jonah pointing us to Jesus and Jesus' own death and resurrection, God's sovereignty was at work way back in 1:1 already. And it all points to our own and the promise that we have to our own death and resurrection. I've pulled a lot of things out here this morning. I've drawn attention to all sorts of details, most of which none of you probably even care to even hear or understand or even think about. But in the end, what Jonah 2 and the prophet's experience in the belly of a fish ultimately points us to is the fact that without God exercising his sovereignty over every facet of life, death, and resurrection, there is no hope. We are dependent upon God's sovereignty and his grace. Jesus says in Matthew 12 that the only sign the Pharisees will get to validate Jesus' claims of being the Messiah is the sign of Jonah, his own death and resurrection, the ultimate act of sovereignty and grace in our life. And what we see in the person of Jonah is a living, breathing example that we can all relate to, somebody who is completely messed up and undeserving and yet receiving. Because the Lord, he does as he pleases. He offers grace and he saves those who are least deserving simply because he can. The Lord does as he pleases.